The big surprise here was that the far left, which includes the socialists and the communists and the Greens and whoever else, the gluten-free party, I don't know, all these different parties came together and said, no, we are going to unite and we are going to get a large number of seats, and they did so.
Hello everyone, I'm John Fowler, CEO and co-founder of International Intrigue and a former Australian diplomat serving in Beijing and Shanghai. With me as always is Jacob Shapiro, the Director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. Jacob, how are you?
I'm good. I saw a video of some Ukrainians throwing fish at a Russian drone, so I'm doing better than that.
Wow, that's a hell of a morning. 2024 has been the year of elections, Jacob, and it seems this week has been sort of like a culmination, or maybe not a culmination, but a week where a lot has happened. Where do you want to start?
Why don't we start with the Brits, who have their house in order for once?
Let's do it.
Great. So the UK had elections, and they elected Keir Starmer as the UK's 58th Prime Minister. That ends 14 years of Conservative Party rule. It is the Conservative Party's worst result in its 190-year history. So when you're dealing with Britain, you're always dealing with long, extended periods of history. So a historical defeat for the Conservatives. Labour won in a landslide, winning 412 out of a possible 650 seats. Several prominent Conservatives, including Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg, all lost their seats in the House of Commons, so we will have to go elsewhere for jokes and comedic timing from some of these wonderful British politicians. Starmer's now Prime Minister, and he has sounded a refreshing tone, John, of moderation and stability, and promising change in a quest to, quote, rebuild the infrastructure of opportunity. It's not just the Conservatives that have lost, though. The Scottish National Party lost nearly 40 seats, almost all of them to Labour. The DUP in Northern Ireland actually lost some seats to Sinn Féin. The Liberal Democrats have become the third largest party in Parliament, and Nigel Farage, after many attempts, finally gets his seat in the House of Commons, with his upstart Populist Party winning a couple of seats. There's maybe a lot to tackle here, but sort of the key takeaway for me is that Starmer's promising pain. He's saying that he's gonna have to really pinch pennies in order to move things forward here for Britain, and Labour has a really colossal majority. I wonder how you see it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways to see it. You can look at the UK's first past the post voting system to sort of pull out some fairly odd results with, the Liberal Democrats getting, I think, 60 or 70 seats despite getting not that many votes. You mentioned Nigel Farage's Reform Party getting, I think, half a dozen seats or so, maybe a few more than that, but they had, I think, the second highest vote share. So there's this weird, that's one element of the UK system. It's not necessarily reflective of how people vote. The second thing is Labour hasn't been in power since, I think it's 14 years, 2010, right? This is kind of inevitable. So I think one of the takes is that this wasn't necessarily a pro-Labour vote per se. It was okay, it is time for a change. Get the hell out of my face to the Tories. And I think that's borne out by the fact that Labour ran a really small strategy. I think they called it a Ming Vase strategy, where they basically didn't say much of what they would do. They said a few things they wouldn't do, and they basically just said it's time for a change. And you touched on that with Keir Starmer saying there's going to be some pain. Labour is the sort of centre-left party traditionally in the UK. They've had historically a tough time winning elections. I think he's the first Labour Prime Minister since Tony Blair to go from opposition to leadership. So I think they basically just wanted to say, hey, we're not going to come in and spend a ton of money, blow up the debt. We're also not going to do austerity. We're not going to do radical things. We're going to put you first. We're going to fix some of the things that are broken and end the chaos of Tory kind of leadership, which is Johnson, Truss, Sunak, all these characters. So I don't know. It's not a surprising result. I'm looking to see how the UK approaches two big things. One is Brexit. They ruled that out, the Labour Party, despite people wanting to say, let's reopen that debate. Starmer said not in his lifetime. So they're going to have to forge closer relations with the EU. And then the second thing is how the US relationship develops if Trump is elected. I think not much will change, but the UK-US relationship isn't as strong or as important as it probably once was. So I'll just be interested to see how they handle that.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I think everything you said is true, and maybe it'll be a really ephemeral sense of unity, but I do think it's sort of this rare thing where, British politics has all been about the system coming apart at the seams now for years. And this is at least one step back in the United Kingdom moving forward.
things can kind of just happen nicely and as they're supposed to. Yeah, it's a refreshing story in that way. From things happening predictably and as polls would suggest they were going to turn out, to France. We had the France parliamentary elections, or the second round of France parliamentary elections last weekend. And the headlines, Jacob, I'm sure you saw them, were pretty surprising because the right-leaning Marine Le Pen's party, RN, they became the third place getters. I think they got 143 seats in the end, despite being odds-on favourite to kind of have a fairly whopping majority. France's leftist coalition, so a group of left-wing parties that kind of banded together to stop her National Rally Party, got 182 seats, the most, and then Macron's centrist got 168. So they came in third, which I think is a huge surprise. But I would just temper that with saying that they still won a lot more votes than everybody else, more parliamentary votes than they've ever won before. They only got 7 seats in 2017, so 143 now. You can't sort of paint that any other way than they're growing and getting more influential. But they fell short of that majority that I think all polls had them. I think everyone was worried. So my question to you, well, 2 questions. One, is this the end, or is this the defeat of the far right in France? And the second question is, was Macron... is he a genius? Was his decision to call these snap early elections borne out by their poor showing in the second round of elections?
Well, I think the hysteria around France's elections was not warranted, and you see that in the results. I think Macron's plan was this. He thought that the far right was not going to be able to join forces to challenge the center, and even if they did, that they would embarrass themselves so much that they wouldn't win. And I think he thought that the far left would continue to squabble with itself and not unite so that the centrists would emerge triumphant. He was correct about the far right, and the far right looks silly in the context of all these things. Also, one of my favorite statistics from the weekend, I went back and looked at the second quarter Eurobarometer study poll from this past year, and it found that 37% of French people said that their country was moving in the wrong direction. What was the final vote tally for the RN? It was 37%. So they've sort of reached the high watermark of their support. The big surprise here was that the far left, which includes the socialists and the communists and the Greens and whoever else, the gluten-free party, I don't know. All these different parties came together and said, no, we are going to unite and we are going to get a large number of seats. And they did so. And I think that's where Macron was really sort of taken aback. So he gets the victory lap on, I think he did defang the far right a little bit. It certainly wasn't what they thought it was. The far left surprised him. And now he's in this position where he's going to be dealing with a diverse sort of hung parliament. The other thing, though, here is that if you put Macron centrists together with the Republicans, with some of the other smallest centrist parties, the center held in France. It's not like we're moving far in one direction. It's that, okay, the left has its minority and the right has its minority and the center still holds in France. And I think, honestly, this election told us more about how sick the French people are of Emmanuel Macron, who's kind of a weirdo in his own right, than anything about France teetering towards fascism or towards communism in any case. I think that Macron has actually set up the stage very well for whoever succeeds him to be the breath of fresh air and also to be the centrist standard bearer going forward. So it's a lot of interesting inside baseball, and ironically, I think everybody won and everybody lost at the same time.
Yeah, I really agree. I'd just add that, I mean, I couldn't agree more that France really is sick of Macron, and he doesn't help himself with the way he carries on. But what I think he got right is that he sprung the surprise on the far right, and his bet was they won't be able to organize in time. They won't be able to kind of shift their deck chairs around to be sort of unified and present a genuine ruling alternative. And I think he was borne out. I think that the squabbling, the infighting, I mean, there was a list of things that they did in the early days of when he called the election about, announcing this and then withdrawing it. So I think he got that right. And against expectations, he's lost seats, but he probably outperformed last time anyway. So this might be a return to a more natural kind of lay of the land in France. You mentioned that people who aren't, don't think France is going in the right direction, 37%. National Rally, 37%. That feels about right.
Okay, moving on to what I think is really the surprising election result of the past week. And John, I'm so glad that you let me look up how to pronounce this gentleman's name as I'm introducing him. So Masoud Pezeshkian, a former heart surgeon, will become Iran's next president. He beat a hardline opponent whose name I did not bother to learn how to pronounce because he lost. He's a loser. Sorry to him. Pezeshkian, he got a really interesting constituency of voters. So he got a lot of urban, middle class, and young, but he was also able to activate the reformist camp, led by former President Mohammad Khatami, former President Hassan Rouhani. Now, Pezeshkian is not some kind of revolutionary. He's already said that he's going to toe the line with the supreme leader. He's not going to go against Islam's orthodoxy, any of these other things. But he is a reformist. And what that means in the grand scheme of Iranian politics to me is that he doesn't want the clerics and the IRGC to have all the power. Now, his reformist predecessor, so not the guy he's replacing, but Rouhani, really tried to take it to the IRGC. He threw some IRGC officials in jail. He tried to claw back some of the economy from the IRGC, which has just been slowly eating the Iranian economy in general. I'm really curious to see if he's going to do that. I also, conspiracy Jacob, putting my hat on here, this result really makes the death of former President Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash in May that more suspicious, because it's a real change in who's going to be the front, sort of, the voice piece for the Iranian presidency. Maybe Raisi wasn't doing something. I don't have any evidence for all of that, but interesting that a reformist came up. How did you see what's happening in Iran?
Well, conspiracy theorist Jacob is my favorite Jacob, and I'm going to ask you to expand on that in a little bit. I think you nail it when you say reform isn't reform as we might interpret that sitting here on the east coast of the US. It essentially, as you said, means getting the hardline kind of religious folks out of things like the economy and potentially foreign policy, although not out of foreign policy. And that's a popular view because the Iranian economy is not doing well. And his hardline opponent said sanctions are irrelevant. That's not the reason. We've just got to get through it. We will triumph. And I think a lot of Iranians, particularly in Tehran, some of the more moderate folks who are a little more sort of worldly and have, participate, they see the world, they see the global economy. They say that's not the truth. We're not gonna, push for a revolution. We understand that's not necessarily possible, but we can kind of walk a middle line between having an economy that sits aside the Ayatollah and kind of works for the people as well as, the country. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think the big question here is the Iranian nuclear deal. The campaign it mentioned it a lot. And the candidate who won, I'm not even going to attempt his name, Jacob, because you've nailed it, 1 out of 1. Let's keep our 100% hit rate on that. He said, look, I think it was a good thing. And I think he would be open to rejoining it. But the Iranian general position is that Washington was in breach of it and they need to come back into compliance with it before the Iranians will join it. I think that will probably be the continuation of his position. But I don't think that it will be... I think there's a bigger window for them rejoining the nuclear deal than there would have been had the hardliner won. Having said that, obviously the election in Washington is the big question there because it takes two to tango, and I don't know how politically possible the Iran nuclear deal is, regardless of who wins in November here in the US. What do you think?
The timing is particularly unfortunate. If Pezeshkian had done this during Biden's first year, thank you very much. When the Biden administration was interested in rejoining the Iran nuclear deal, maybe there would be something here. And maybe the supreme leader was cool putting up a reformist because he knows there's no partner in Washington. So he can say that he's being the reasonable one, but he doesn't have to go forward. And in terms of, just to close out conspiracy Jacob, and again, I have no evidence for this. This is just inferring things. But one of the reasons that Raisi was chosen was because he had all the charisma of a wet paper bag. He was seen as a loyalist. He was seen as somebody who was going to toe the line. And if you notice in the past couple of months, his name was starting to get floated for the next supreme leader. And I kind of wonder if maybe Raisi was feeling himself. And maybe he was thinking, he's looking old. Like, maybe I could position myself there. And I think that more important than whether it's reformist or not is this guy going to do what I say as I try and either, pass on to my son or pass on to a chosen next supreme leader. So again, I have no evidence for that. So with that and $4.50, you can go get a shitty coffee at Starbucks. But that's conspiracy, Jacob.
Well, you heard it here first. It makes sense to me. It's as compelling as evidence-free conjecture can be. Now let's move on to another big story. I think one that kind of got missed by the media, Jacob. It involves Japan and the Philippines, and they signed a pretty major defense treaty in Manila. It's called the Reciprocal Access Agreement. Big document, as these things always are. But essentially it allows the Philippines to deploy troops in Japan and vice versa onto their soil. Kind of like, a base sharing agreement or something like this, but just allows the two countries to work much more seamlessly together. Their militaries work much more seamlessly together in each other's territories. The agreement came along pretty quickly. by all accounts, it was negotiated very, very quickly. And the question there is why the rush? And the big looming context here, Jacob, is the South China Sea and Beijing's, or China's claim over 90% of it. This is not a new claim. They've put forward their 9-dash line since I think probably the early 2010s. When I was in China, it was certainly well underway that they thought most of the South China Sea was theirs. But obviously that butts up against the Philippines, and we've seen a couple of flashpoints in recent weeks with China's Coast Guard and the Filipino Navy clashing in the South China Sea. So this Japanese-Philippines defense agreement would seem to have been spurred by that. What do you make of it?
Well, you know, John, that Japan's constitution is technically a pacifist constitution. They're not supposed to have any offensive military capabilities. They're not supposed to undertake any offensive military actions. That's their punishment for their role in World War II. This was something that former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated a couple of years ago now, tried to change but couldn't change. But for me, one of the key takeaways here is even if he couldn't change the constitution, Japan's security establishment is proceeding as if Japan is going to need to be offensive in defending Japanese interests. And that's exactly, I think, what's going on here. Japan has been flirting with closer ties with the Philippines for a few years now, sort of low-level economic ties, trade deals, maybe providing them with some ships for their Coast Guard and things like that. But you're right, this is certainly a big step up. And I think it's a pretty big success, honestly, for the Philippines. I view the Philippines as the one in the last couple of months, not in general, they're obviously not the ones that are trying to claim the whole South China Sea for themselves, but I think in the last couple of months, they have been trying to goad China and create the South China Sea issue, or I shouldn't say create, make the South China Sea issue louder so that countries like Japan, like Australia, like the United States will make security guarantees or invest in the Philippines' defense going forward. And I think they have Japan. They've hooked Japan, and Japan is obviously thinking in the long run, okay, if we're going to defend Taiwan, if we're going to think to our interests beyond U.S. security commitments, which now might feel a little more wishy-washy with what's happening with the U.S. election, like we're going to need to do these things in order to have that. So it's the thing that the media misses in general, I think, is Japan. I think Japan is just very quietly sitting there and becoming a much stronger power in the region. And for me, the question there is, well, what is China going to do? Because Japan can do all these things, but it still is really dependent on the Chinese economy. And if China's really upset about this, there are things they can do to punish Japanese companies as a result. And so far, they're not doing that. They're just making very, very strong statements, lecturing Japan to remember their history.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the key point you pointed out there is Japan's offensive capability. And, Japan's geography, they're an island stuck away fairly north in that region. They need access to the South China Sea for its maritime routes, for, security. They need that to be an area that is international and used by everybody. If China dominates it, it's not good for Japan. It's basically their whole western flank is exposed to a country that they have a mortal contest with over hundreds of years. But I think that's a great point. And then the second thing is that the Philippines, I wonder if these kind of flashpoints, you mentioned, I think recently that you thought the Philippines was kind of engineering these clashes. I wonder if the Philippines was doing that for a domestic political reason ahead of announcing this, kind of saying like, we need to remind our people and the region that China is an ongoing threat. So let's provoke them a little bit. We know China will take the bait. They always take the bait. They're silly like that. When we announce this, people will be a little less concerned that Japan is militarizing, that we are allowing Japan to militarize, and it'll just be like, oh yeah, it's obviously to stop China. And then it makes it much more politically easy in Southeast Asian capitals to kind of sell. That's not really a conspiracy theory, but that's my conjecture.
Close enough. All right, well, we've done a lot of nitty gritty, so why don't we pull back here? And let's talk a little bit about sort of the thread that connects all the things that we've talked about here, and maybe by way of the NATO Summit, the 3-day summit that's marking the alliance's 75th anniversary that's being held in Washington. And I think the coverage has been particularly short-sighted because the whole thing has now become a referendum on whether Joe Biden has his mental faculties or not. So we're looking at his press conference, and we're watching him introduce Zelensky as Putin, my God, and calling his vice president Trump. But that's all anybody is covering. And I don't think anybody else is thinking about, okay, even as we have all these elections and all this nitty-gritty of politics is going on, you've got largely the most powerful military alliance in the world calling out China for its role in supporting Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war, talking about increased military spending in general, but then looming all over it is, will the most powerful nation in the alliance in 6 months' time even care about the alliance? If it is President Trump, what is he going to do? Is he going to go around yelling at people and trying to, close the war by calling up his friend Vladimir Putin and eating more chocolate cake with Xi Jinping? I think a lot of the instability that we're seeing in politics all around the world is responding to the way the Olympians are hurling these thunderbolts at each other. And in some ways, the problem is too big for people to even focus on. So I'm curious what you think of the Olympians as they lodge their rhetorical thunderbolts back and forth.
Yeah, it's interesting because in one way, not much happened in this NATO summit. As you said, Biden dominated it, but even in substance, not a lot happened. I think the biggest thing you've pointed out there is pretty robustly calling out China as a problem. And also, I think they're getting closer and closer to opening a NATO office in Tokyo, which would be a fairly dramatic step for NATO and give a lot of succor to those folks who say NATO is an expansionist, colonialist kind of organization. It's harder to make the argument that no, we're defensive if you're opening North Atlantic Treaty Organization offices in Japan on the Pacific. But be that as it may, the big thing here is I think I can't make my mind up, Jacob, and you might have a better read on this. I can't make my mind up on whether Donald Trump, we know he doesn't like multilateral organizations, but is he actually an existential threat to NATO, or is he a welcome stress test? I don't think he knows what he is. I don't think he has a depth of thought where he kind of thinks 7 steps ahead. But I wonder whether he'll be a long-term good thing for NATO, because I was looking at a chart before we came on here of NATO's defense spending member states. And in 2015, it was shrinking. And every year since then, it has grown at an increasing rate. Each country there is spending more of their GDP on their own defense than they were before. Now, part of that is the macro geopolitical environment. It's getting a more dangerous world. Russia's on the front foot, so they would have done that naturally. But I think there's something to say that Trump has shaken up NATO enough that everyone is taking their collective defense more seriously. And I think long term, maybe that's a good thing. I saw this morning he was saying that he might stop intelligence sharing with European countries. Okay, so maybe they have to boost up their own domestic intelligence services. I don't know. It's a bit of a conspiracy theory again that he might be a long-term good for NATO, but I'm not so sure that if the US plays a smaller role in European collective defense, that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I think the first thing to think about with NATO is that NATO was an alliance designed to combat the Soviet Union. Full stop. So the threat that NATO was designed to go after is gone. And so now it is a bureaucracy that has outlived itself and in some sense is a military alliance in search of an enemy, which is a dangerous thing for a military alliance to be in search of, which leaves aside, like China is doing things that are aggressive, they are revanchist, like China is a challenge in general, but NATO also wants a boogeyman. It wants someone that it can latch its claws into, because I think for decades now, NATO's sort of been drifting with, well, why do we have to spend 2% of GDP on defense? Like the United States has the biggest military in the world by a factor of 10 and everything else is going fine. To your point, everything else is not going fine right now. But I also think the end of NATO, and it will happen eventually, whether it happens during a second Trump administration or 40 years from now, like all good things must come to an end. But I don't think NATO's ever going to be dissolved. Like they're going to go out and say, oh, we now dissolve NATO. NATO is no longer extant. What's going to happen is there will be some kind of military conflict, and a country will invoke Article 5, which is the article that says all these countries are bound to each other for collective defense. And some countries might say, nope, not going to show up. And then we're off to the races. And it's funny that, NATO has been such an effective alliance because it never had to be invoked. It was not invoked once against the Soviet Union. The only time NATO's ever been invoked was by the United States around 9/11. So I think that at some point, and whether we can debate about, is that going to be 2 years from now? Is that going to be 10 years from now? At some point, I think one of the major countries in NATO will invoke that Article 5, expecting people to come to their aid, and they might not come to their aid. And then we'll be talking about the demise of the alliance. But in the here and now, the United States is still too powerful. NATO still has too much inertia, and there isn't a rival that's anywhere close to NATO's military power to make any of these conversations real. So I take your point that whatever occupant is in the White House, whatever they decide to say about NATO, that's not what's going to kill NATO. What's going to kill NATO in the long run, I think, is that it was designed for something that doesn't exist anymore, and it doesn't seem to be aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think some folks might push back on you and say that threat doesn't exist anymore. I think Finland and Sweden joining NATO would suggest they feel that threat from Russia. It's definitely not like it was in the Soviet Union. It's definitely not like an existential kind of, if we don't do this, we will become part of the Soviet Union. But, I think there is an element that China, Russia, if they're ever able to organize together, and I'm very skeptical of that because most folks don't realize, but China and Russia truly, again, dislike each other to their core, and they are cooperating now out of, convenience and China's dominant position. But I can see NATO becoming relevant with an enemy that is worthy of its time in the near future. But here's the thing you mentioned that I think is important about NATO, and it is a giant bureaucracy. Europe goes to war every, let's say, 50 years, except for the last, 100 years. What NATO has done has integrated each country's militaries, has got generals talking to each other, has political leaders meeting every year about military and security things. And, without drawing too long a bow, these things matter for keeping peace. Just like people say the monetary union in the EU has kept Europe peaceful, so NATO has been the military element of that. And I think NATO's purpose now, to your point, probably isn't the collective security of Europe, but it's just kind of like, all right, well, let's just keep talking so we don't kill each other, so we don't turn our 2% of GDP somewhere else, like at our neighbors. And that feels worthwhile, but because it's not kind of the express purpose of NATO, you wonder how legitimate it is and how long it'll last. But I think I don't disagree with anything you said.
And I agree with everything you said. The only thing that I would add based on what you said was...
it's not good TV, though.
Well, I hope this doesn't happen for the Finns and the Swedes, but I would love to see Russia try. Good luck on that expedition, Russia. Have fun.
They had to go once, right, in the 50s, and it didn't go super well for them. So, yeah, nope. I mean, Russia is well overextended, so I don't think it's particularly likely, but you never know. Putin's a madman. All right, Jacob, let's wrap up. I want to wrap up with one thing, and it's a little out of our wheelhouse in terms of foreign policy, but President Biden's dominating the news. You must have a view on whether he'll drop out and whether he should drop out. So what's your 60-second hot take on the situation that's going on?
Throwing me a curveball there at the end. Do you even know what a curveball is in Australia? You probably don't.
That's a spin ball, right?
Yeah, something like that. Look, the only person who can take Biden out of the race is Biden. There's nothing that can be done to force his hand. So he has to decide that he's going to leave the race, and he is not exhibiting the symptoms of somebody who thinks that he needs to lead the race at all. And no amount of New York Times editorials and George Clooney statements and Barack Obama cryptic comments, like no amount of those sorts of things are going to get him out. He's going to have to decide to leave of his own accord. So it seems to me that he's probably going to stick in there. I'll also just say, I mean, on a personal level, Jon Stewart was saying this, and it really resonated with me. I mean, I've watched parents get old, get senile, deal with dementia, things like that. And I think the most disturbing thing about Biden for me and from my own personal experience is that when somebody is going through that, they double down. They white knuckle on what they have left of their consciousness because they can feel it drifting away, and they don't want help, and they don't want to go to the neurologist, and they tell you everything is fine. And it's gaslighting. Just tell us that something is wrong and tell us what you're willing to do about it. Reagan had Alzheimer's at the end. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke at the end of his presidency. Both of those guys had cabinets that were around them, had all sorts of things in place so that the machinery of state could continue. And that's Biden's greatest resource. He connects people. He's been there for 50 years. He knows where everybody works. He has everybody's skeletons in the closet. He's got the aid. Like, he's got all that sort of thing. And I don't know. I wish he would just be honest. But I know that like the position that he's in probably prevents him from being honest in general. Anyway, so that was a personal take. The hot take, I think, is I don't see him dropping out until he decides he has to drop out. And he hasn't said anything that suggests that's going to happen.
We finally have our first disagreement. I think he will drop out. I think the pressure, it's not going to stop. Every single day will be like this. Congressmen, senators, they're all going to go back to their districts. They're going to hear consistently, this guy can't run, this guy can't run. As long as I think it'll happen before the convention, because if it gets to the convention and he's the nominee, then I agree with you. It can't happen after that. But I still have some belief that his family and his closest advisors will go to him and they'll take away the car keys. They'll say, you can't drive anymore, Granddad. You're going to kill someone else. It's time. And I think it will just be because of the drip. There is absolutely no way that he can win the election now, in my view. 2 weeks from now, it gets worse. So I do think he'll drop out. But it's tough to watch right now. And the last thing I'll say on this is I've heard a lot of folks on Twitter say that some argument of what you mentioned, which is the machinery of state is still working. His advisors are all, he's done a good job. That's all true, but that's not the modern presidency. That was true in the 20s, 50s, even as late as maybe the 80s or 90s, 80s, I would argue. But now the job is communicator in chief. He needs to be a forceful prosecutor in public for policies and America's place in the world. And he can't string a sentence together. He can't introduce the president of Ukraine correctly. That means, I think, 70% of his job, he can't do. So he has to drop out. We'll see, but my hot take is that he will.
We do have a disagreement. I'll take the other side of that bet, my friend.
What a good place to leave it. Thanks, Jacob. We'll be back next week.